All right, if people could take their seat, we'll begin panel 2, community outreach and engagement. So the theme of this session is to discuss the challenges, the opportunities, our experience, and lessons learned around engagement of our communities and outreach to our communities. And in this case, we're actually focused less on our user communities, which was covered very well in the last session, and more on our non-research communities, our public communities. And as an introduction, I'd just like to make a couple of points. So when we talk about communities, we're talking about people who have a shared interest in a particular area. And as facilities, that area could be related to our research or the outcomes of our research, or it could be the physical area or virtual area that is touched by our facility. The second point I want to make is that we talk about how research builds communities, particularly scientific and professional communities. But in this case, our communities can build our research. We can engage the peoples of our communities, and as members of those communities, we can engage them throughout the process, from formulating research ideas, to contributing to the research process, to expanding the research impacts, and the development of policy around our research. And these are really important areas to consider when we talk about public engagement and community engagement activities. So in the terms of the format, it's very similar to the previous panel discussion and panel format. We have 3 speakers who are experts in community engagement within their activities, and in particular, engagement in areas such as engaging our Indigenous peoples and communities in our research activities and those of our facility. So we have Pauline Girard, Deputy Director of the International Institute for Sustainable Development, Experimental Lakes Area; Georgina Lloyd, Assistant Deputy Minister, Crown Indigenous Relationships and Northern Affairs Canada, or CERNAC; and Danielle Luc, Director, Corporate Services, Ocean Networks, Canada. Each will give a 10-minute presentation, followed again by a general discussion where all of the facility members can talk about what they've learned, what they're doing, what challenges they've met around the community engagement. So I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you. So what do I do to, is it the green button to change the slides? Okay, perfect. So I'm Pauline Girard. I work for the IISD Experimental Lakes Area. We are a new MSI facility, and I think it's fair to say on behalf of all of our group that are here today, we are really excited to be here. And this is probably the most intimidating room I've spoken to for a long time, so bear with me. I want to start by acknowledging that I traveled here yesterday from our headquarters in Winnipeg, which are located in Treaty 1 traditional lands of the Anishinaabe, the Cree, Oji-Cree, Dakota, and Dene people, and on the homeland of the Métis Nation. Uh-oh, how do I go back? Red? And the ISD Experimental Lakes Area Research Facility is located in northwestern Ontario on the traditional territory of Treaty 3, the Anishinaabe Nation, and the homeland of the Métis Nation. And as I hope you hear today, we really try and live by the fact that we respect the treaties that were made on these territories, and we dedicate ourselves to move forward in partnership with Indigenous communities in a spirit of reconciliation and collaboration. So we are located in a very remote area of northwestern Ontario. We were originally established in 1968 by the federal government when these small 58 boreal lakes were set aside for scientific research. And the work that we do is really ecosystem science. So we do whole ecosystem research on whole lakes to try and understand the impacts that we as humans are having on freshwater systems. This is a bird's eye view of our facility. We have accommodation for about 60 people, and then we're pretty full during the open water season, which is from about May till right about now. We still have about 35 people on site, but by 2 weeks from now, there'll be about 5 probably. We have an analytical chemistry lab, a number of biology labs that are well equipped for aquatic ecotoxicology, fisheries research, algal ecology, benthic invertebrate ecology. And we work in partnership with universities and governments and industry to really look at how we're impacting freshwater systems here in Canada and around the world. We have 55 years of whole ecosystem science, and we've done everything from adding nutrients to lakes to understand eutrophication and large algal blooms. We've acidified a lake over 11 years to look at the impacts of acid rain on the whole ecosystem. We are at the end of about 6 years of study on oil, trying to understand what happens when oil spills happen in freshwater systems and how can we best clean up those systems. We have a whole series of studies on pharmaceuticals. Artificial estrogen, which is the hormone found in birth control pills, is probably the biggest one, but we've also done work on metformin, which is a common diabetes drug, venlafaxine, which is a common antidepressant, and a number of others. And right now at ELA, probably the biggest project we have going on is on microplastics. And we're currently adding microplastics to one of our lakes to try and understand what happens when microplastics end up in lakes and freshwater systems. Where do they go? How do they move through the system? How do they end up in the tissue of fish? And what does that mean for fish behavior and the ecosystem of that lake as a whole? In 2014, the experimental lakes area moved from being a government facility to under operations of the International Institute for Sustainable Development, which is a not-for-profit research-based organization that does policy research globally around the concept and ideas of sustainable development. And one of the first things that we did is, well, firstly, we recognized that ELA is unique and incredibly valuable because of the whole ecosystem science that can happen there, and because of the long-term data set that we have on these lakes. However, the facility and the work has the real potential to inspire, and we're located in Treaty 3 territory, and we need to understand what that means and build relationships within those communities. And so starting in 2014, we started what we now call the Education and Indigenous Relations Program. And our objectives today are to educate and inspire the next generation of freshwater enthusiasts and to build meaningful relationships with Indigenous people and communities to respect and protect the land and water and learn from one another. And what that looks like is high school level field courses and visits to the experimental lakes area, a lot of school work in schools, professional development days for teachers, and then the relationship building with communities. We host an annual fall feast at ELA where we bring elders and youth to talk about issues related to the natural environment and water. We started a few years ago, actually last year, doing a water ceremony in the spring and the fall to pay respect to Nibi, which is water, the water that we work on. And then we have collaborative research projects with a number of communities in our area. We have a new big body of work that Vince Pallas, our head scientist, is starting on wild rice. We have community members who have sit on the research advisory boards for a lot of the large projects that we do, like the oil project, for example. And we support communities and Indigenous organizations in the region, like Treaty 3, who we support in their initiatives on community-based monitoring. So why do we do this? Like I said at the beginning, we do science that is having an impact here in Canada and around the world, but we believe that we are from Northwestern Ontario and we need to be doing work that is reflecting the needs of communities and neighbors around us as well. And by doing that work, we are also having big global impact that everyone is here today. We have found firsthand, and actually I'm sure all of you have, and we talked a little bit about it before in the session previously, But the science, and particularly the land-based work that we do, really has the potential to inspire. When you bring people to the facility and give them an opportunity to see the science that they have, their eyes light up. And, you know, I've seen grandmothers like squeal with glee when they open a seine net and see fish in it. I've seen teenagers that come to our facility with their hoods up and their lips closed, and after one night and day kind of talking to people, are asking super thoughtful and intelligent questions. And I've had a 16-year-old from Eagle Lake First Nation who's been in and out of care in Winnipeg ask me, what do I have to do to end up working in a place like this? And those are incredible stories, and they are really why we do this. And then finally, we do applied research that is intended to have an impact on how we're managing our freshwater systems here in Canada, around the world. And we have seen from the literature, and we've also seen firsthand, that there's a direct connection between legitimacy and policy impact. And so when you design research studies that consider and reflect the points of view of multiple stakeholders, then there's stronger policy impact through the results of those studies. So that's why we work with academics, with government partners, with industry, and that's why we work with communities, and we try and integrate their needs and interests into the work that we do. Oh. So what have we learned? We have learned that translating the science into both general public information, we do a lot of work on kind of making the science accessible to all kinds of audiences. We have blogs, we have really active social media, we give presentations, we do infographics, and we have actually physically translated a lot of the general public information into Anishinaabe Mawin or Ojibwe language. And that is valuable both for the students and general public that we're working with, but it's also super valuable for the students and the research scientists. We now have a group of scientists that are amazing communicators, and I think it's because we've worked with them and helped them think about how to speak about what they're doing in real ways that people can understand. And it's great, all the kind of graduate students that come to ELA, they get the opportunity to participate in this sort of communications work as well, and it's really kind of meaningful to help them through that process of thinking about how can we communicate our research better and make it more understandable to everyone. Over the years, we have moved on the Indigenous relations side, we have moved from calling it engagement and outreach to relationship building. And that's a really important distinction. We have been very intentional to not set really kind of big objectives for ourselves on our collaboration with Indigenous partners. We try and spend the time and listen hard and work together, and feel that those relationships are really key to the success of making sure that those partnerships work. We have learned that everyone likes to get muddy, and even if you don't like to get muddy, you remember when you do, and that's a great way to get people's hands wet and dirty and show them the fish and let them smell them and touch them, and they will remember that and talk about it for years to come. And we've learned that bringing together Indigenous and Western science leads to unexpected outcomes. So mostly in terms of inspiration, it's really fun to get scientists, Western scientists who are very kind of, logistical and practical, together with elders who are scientists in their own right, and really kind of thinking about what that means. We did some work over the last number of years related to that microplastics project that I spoke about, trying to think about how can we bring together Indigenous perspectives into the science methodology and the research study itself. And it was really hard at the beginning because there's not a lot of kind of long-term traditional knowledge on plastics, right? But what there is long-term traditional knowledge on is the respect for water and the understanding of the land. And so eventually what the elders told us is, you have to bring ceremony into your work. You need to respect the water, and you need to bring that in. And with that, then we're bringing our own science and our perspectives. And it was fantastic because the plastics team really took that on, and they took it on all on their own. And now, so they are they're dosing the lake with plastics every 2 weeks. And before they do that lake dose, they bring tobacco and they give an offering of tobacco into the lake on that day before they do it. And you know, like you can't sort of quantify that from a Western science way, but it is very powerful. And it's powerful for the students who are involved, and it's powerful for us in terms of acknowledging, you know, different ways of looking at the land and water and different points of view and reconciliation. And that's it. Thank you.
Green one advances, right?
Green one is advancing.
Okay. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for allowing me the opportunity to present on behalf of Ocean Networks Canada here today. Before I start, I'd really like to acknowledge that with the longest coastline in the world, Canada really is an ocean nation. And I would like to acknowledge that Indigenous peoples have been the stewards of the land and water for time immemorial. And their historic relationships with land and sea continue to this day. Ocean Networks Canada is hosted at the University of Victoria on the traditional territory of the Lekwungen peoples. And I really am ever so grateful and like to acknowledge and respect the many, many diverse Indigenous peoples with whom we at ONC have the honor to collaborate. So Ocean Networks Canada, really we like to think of ourselves as Canada's national ocean observing infrastructure. We supplement other work that Amundsen Science does with the ship-based research. We operate deep ocean and coastal observatory systems that collect imagery, sound recordings, high-resolution sensor measurements on a multitude of different instruments, 24/7 many times, and that serve a multitude of scientific disciplines, all the way from what you might think about as traditional oceanography to geophysics and even the particle physics community. We continuously archive and deliver this data openly. We don't screen our users in near real time through our Oceans 3.0 data management system. And that system can be accessed by anybody on the globe, 24/7, any time of the world. So really we're trying to bring the information that our observing systems collect to humanity. Shown here are some of the examples of the services and solutions ONC's data and data products provide for really science, society, and industry. So we enable scientific discovery, innovation, and evidence-based decision-making on, for example, ocean management, disaster mitigation, as well as environmental protection. And we're really looking for ways on how we can use our privilege of being a national research facility, how we can contribute to reconciliation. And as we witness unprecedented changes to our climate, ocean monitoring data really are crucial to a huge diversity of unique communities with different priorities, needs, and interests. And again, similar to what Georgina has said, we really need to listen to them to ensure that the data are findable, usable, and most importantly, relevant to them. Through our outreach and engagement, our goal really is to build and nurture long-lasting relationships with communities and the data users to support the co-creation of knowledge and mobilization of research to inform equitable policy and decision-making. And based on what we heard when talking to the communities, we're focusing a lot on initiatives that support Indigenous talent and engaged youth to become confident change makers and leaders. And respecting Indigenous knowledge systems is really an essential practice in this journey. We also enable communities to collect their own ocean data. And in the following, over the next little while, I've selected 3 examples from the range of ONC's community programs geared at different age groups to share with you today. So the Community Fishers Program is a community science program where community members themselves go and collect water property data from small vessels to monitor their local ocean conditions. And the first step really is to build the relationship. So that oftentimes takes quite a lot of time. Once we've done this, we support the program through an easy-to-use, low-bandwidth data portal that allows the upload of the data for community science partners. And many of these communities are really generous in sharing this data through our open Oceans 3.0 data portal, because we are actually able to attribute the data to them, and they retain ownership and control through data agreements that we enter into with them. We also have the ability to fence off some data that they might not want to share, but most of them are actually really generous in contributing their work to the global community. Keystone of this program is a training program that incorporates both field and classroom content, and that actually leads to certification through the University of Victoria Continuing Studies program, as well as the United Nations Institute for Training and Research. And this really gives the community members who participate in here broadly acknowledged credentials that will help them with their to advance their careers. And finally, as part of this program, or of all of our work, it's really important to share the work that the community has done in meaningful ways. What I've shown here is an example of an interactive story map, actually, that our team built together with the community members after the completion of a 3-year baseline monitoring project in Iqaluit. And this tool allows the sharing of different perspectives. It captures the voices and contributions of the community members themselves who participated in this work. And it really enabled the community members to then be active participants in discussions about future economic developments in their region. So switching gear now to the Youth Science Ambassador Program, which is a program which provides part-time employment for early career people. So the youth here are 18 to 25 years old, generally, and they develop programs. They work with local knowledge holders as well as local educators. We support them through that to develop programs that are of importance to them in their own community. And by doing that, they gain really valuable scientific skills by interacting with the data, as well as education and leadership skills. Earlier this year, we had the opportunity to bring youth scientists from several communities from the East Coast and from the West Coast together at a conference, and then for a week following the conference, to share their knowledge and really fully bringing to life the vision of this program of making local observations and building global connections. The program has grown to, move the slide here. The program has grown to 12 positions supported through a diversity of funding sources, including the NSERC Promo Science program. And as you can see on the map on the top right, these are, the positions are in locations where we actually have ocean observing infrastructure. And the young woman on the photos here is Mia Otokiak. She was our first youth science ambassador in Cambridge Bay in Nunavut in 2016. So on the left, she's working with some youth during a maintenance visit that we had to the community for the observatory in that community. And she then continued on to mentor youth through other northern programs, and is now a technical advisor at the Nunavut Impact Review Board. And on the right, she shared her experience as being a member of this program at the UN conference in Lisbon. So she's really a remarkable young woman, and we're very happy that we could support them. So finally, our youth programs. Here we're aiming primarily at middle to high school students, and we're aiming to foster the interest and opportunity for underrepresented youth in STEM to pursue ocean-related careers. And again, here we're working together with educators and community knowledge holders to co-develop and deliver learning resources that are aligned with school curricula in this case, but they are directly relevant to communities and incorporate local knowledge. One lesson we have learned is that in particular for small and remote communities, it's really important that we reach the youth in their own hometown. And we do this through in-person visits, through hybrid and virtual activities. And by doing this, we are really hoping to foster a growing network of Canadian schools and students, each sharing their discoveries and collaborating on science and engineering projects, utilizing data from ONC's coastal and deep ocean sensors and working together. Operating two things here at the same time. So, to live up to our commitment to meaningful community engagement, we dedicate resources that provide technical and learning expertise both within ONC as well as in our interactions with others. And here really I need to acknowledge our amazing team at ONC. It really takes, this aim of this work, the motivation really permeates through the entire organization. But I also recognize that we're only really one part of an entire community of ocean stewards, and therefore building and maintaining partnerships so that we can lift each other up is key to achieving larger societal benefits. And as I hope I've shown you throughout my presentation, just counting these engagements is really not enough to measure the success or the impact of the work that we do. Really, I think we need to look at much more qualitative indicators to assess this work. And with that, I thank you and our funders and the communities who do all this amazing work with us, and I look forward to continued discussions.
Good morning. So thank you very much for inviting me. I'm going to admit that I think I'm going to be changing gears a little bit here today because I'm not associated with an MSI directly. So in my role, I'm the Assistant Deputy Minister for Northern Affairs in Crown Indigenous Relations and Northern Affairs Canada at the Government of Canada. And we do a lot of work when it comes to Indigenous and Northern engagement and have kind of just built up tons of experience and expertise, and what does it mean to co-develop and co-manage and work in collaboration with partners. And so I'm going to be speaking from that voice today. Our team is responsible for a whole suite of things, some of them touching the scientific realm in terms of we manage programs and investments around northern contaminants and how they cycle through country food and how that impacts food security. We also do a number of research efforts to support our work under remediating all of the abandoned mine sites across the north, of which there are 163. And we are the face for the Crown Indigenous relationship for Canada across the north. And so it is our teams that are kind of really those brokers that are building and renewing those relationships. So I'm going to speak kind of from a little bit of that broad perspective. I do have some experience, and our team played a big role in the early stages in the design and bringing on board the Canadian High Arctic Research Station in Cambridge Bay, Nunavut, and that is now operated by Polar Knowledge Canada. So we have worked very closely with that organization as well in terms of what does it look like to have a best practice for engagement and a collaborative model for a research program. So just that's a little bit of the context of where I'll be speaking from. And I guess before I actually jump in, I would also like to just pay my respects and be really thoughtful about the fact that I find it a huge privilege for us to all be able to have this space and occupy this space of Treaty 6 and the Métis homelands here in Saskatoon. And I think the very fact that we can have such productive discussions here and be welcome to do so, I think it's a real privilege for us as Canadians. So thank you very much for that. So I'm going to start with a space where I think, when I look back at my education over my lifetime, and I look at what some of my kids and their peers are learning in even grade school and high school today about the Crown Indigenous history in this country, and even just the Indigenous history in this country, I think there's huge blackout spots here. I think there's a big education gap in what the Crown Indigenous history really is. And so that's a really important starting point, because I think if we're talking about reconciliation and what does it mean to renew relationships with Indigenous peoples, we really have to go to truth first. And truth sometimes is a hard place to be. It's a hard place to sit. And it really takes, I'd say, reflection of kind of everybody at an individual level. So I think that before kind of we even begin anything that we do with Indigenous peoples and Northerners, we really look to kind of what is the history there, what are the agreements in place, what have been the legal decisions that have framed, or the policy decisions that have framed our interactions and how we are operating in a relationship today. And you see kind of some of the documents there, the Indian Act from 1876. These are things that really did cause long legacies of pretty impactful harm for communities. So I think it's important that every Canadian stops here and starts here, because it really does mean that Indigenous peoples across this country are all at a different starting place for what it means to renew the relationship. There's not a lot of trust in the system because we've had generations and generations and generations of making decisions that don't build trust. And so when we are now in a place where we're coming from the people who came before us and made these harmful decisions, it's a hard place to be sometimes. And so I think honoring that and being thoughtful about it is really important. The other thing that influences heavily the work we do and how we approach any relationship outside of history is the legal framework of the relationship. And so we have a number of elements here that guide us in some ways, but they help to kind of help us navigate where can we move within this relationship and where has it been legally scoped, I would say. So obviously with Indigenous peoples, south of 60 and most of the First Nations in Canada, the Indian Act remains to be a tool that is a real guiding document. It's been amended many, many, many times over a long history in Canada, and so it's a little bit of a complex document to navigate, but there are still some real critical governance pieces in there that frame Indigenous and particularly First Nations on reserve and the tools that they have to come to the table with Canada. In 1982, we of course built in rights, and essentially what we did with the Constitution was these rights of Indigenous rights have always been inherent. They are there whether we have a constitution or not. They are inherent rights and exist and pre-existed this country. And so part of what the Constitution did was recognize those inherent rights and affirm them. And so there is a recognition that those rights that have always been there are protected by the Constitution. That's really important because when we look at the law across the land, the Constitution is the highest piece, and so it is. It really is kind of a big level of protection for those rights. And the Constitution also provided a recognition that there are distinctions. And so it is a very diverse country, and of course there is a recognition for rights holders that are First Nations, Métis, and Inuit across the country. And so there are a number of important elements that the Constitution brought. And what we've been moving towards is the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, which is really about going beyond the legal minimum of what the Constitution framework sets out and finding a path. We heard earlier about collaboration and partnership and how do we do that. And so There is a United Nations Declaration Act in Canada and a number of interim action plan measures that we've committed to make sure that we're always looking at this beyond just the legal requirements. There's a little piece there just about other mechanisms. Of course, we've heard a lot about those things. They are the treaties, they are some of the sectoral self-government agreements, and there's a lot of other governance work happening. I'll pause a little bit on the north because we've heard quite a bit of northern context here today. And the one thing I'll mention is when the act that I operate under in Northern Affairs was first established, it was really established so Ottawa could run the territories from Ottawa. And it did so for a very long time. And one of the things we've been doing over the last 20 years is a process of devolution. So we've been devolving all of the decisions that Ottawa and Canada does not need to hold or own to the territorial governments. Territorial governments don't have the same constitutional protections as Indigenous peoples. They do not have the same standing as provinces, for example, and so it is really important for us to make sure that the decisions Canada doesn't have to make, we don't hold on to, and we leave the territories to make those decisions since they are best placed. They are there on the ground and know kind of best how to govern natural resources and environmental assessment. So I touched a little bit on Section 35 of the Constitution. The one thing I will say, I'm not a lawyer, so I don't want to have too much legal speak here, but I think it's important because it frames the relationship with Indigenous peoples. What I'll say about Section 35 is when the Constitution came into play in Canada, there was a lot of interpretation and differing interpretation about what did that mean. Is it a full box of rights or is it an empty box of rights that has to be filled? And between Canada and Indigenous peoples, we had very different interpretations. Today, we'd view it as a full box of rights, but that's after decades and decades and decades of Indigenous peoples moving decisions through the Supreme Court of Canada to define those parameters of Section 35. And so those decisions have really been an important framework for us. They are how we operate today. They are the guidelines and include very high details of specificity about what those rights are and what those rights aren't, what the limits of them are from cultural, social, political, economic rights, the right to fish and hunt, and kind of how the treaty and inherent rights play out. And so it's an important point because it really guides all of the self-determination for Indigenous peoples, and for them it is fundamental to enter into any relationship. The one point I will make though, so I think we've gotten a great amount of work out of the court system in Canada to be able to better understand these rights, but that has come at a cost because generally you don't build very productive relationships on the front steps of courthouses. It means we've actually had that trust that wasn't there before has really kind of not grown over time, and it really is, it makes the renewal of the relationship challenging in some ways. So what does this mean for, those are the obligations, it's a need for Canada, it's a need to do, not a nice to do. What does it mean and how do we take up those obligations in practice? Like how do we do our jobs? I have a number of policies listed across this slide, and the key feature I'd say about all of these things is that they are all collaboratively developed. So essentially co-developed processes, and when you co-develop any type of policy with Indigenous peoples, you really, and the Arctic and Northern Policy Framework was co-developed with all Northerners and territories and Indigenous peoples. So when you do co-development work, it really is, you know, in the past we had really a structured way of going in to make policy where Canada had its mandate. We knew where we wanted to land. We knew kind of how far we could go within that, and then we went and negotiated it for some time. We're not in that world in the co-development space. We actually just have to blow that all up and start from a let's work together and how are we going to do this and build that piece together. And so it really puts us in challenging spaces sometimes that we're not used to navigating, and it takes way more time, and you go on pathways that are not linear, but the product you get at the end of the day is much more robust. And so I haven't included tons of details about these, but the policies are there. I encourage you to go look at them, because those are the result of years and sometimes decades of negotiation and working collaboratively with people. And you will see some of the things that where you land in those processes is about principles first. It's about relevance and results and kind of how we do all of those things together. And there's really great language, kind of, I'd say, in each of those policies that helps us to navigate the spaces we need to. So I think I'll just end with, so what has all of this led? What do we know to be a good practice in Canada, and how do we approach our relationship with Indigenous peoples and with Northerners? And I have a number of things included there, and I would say, kind of first and foremost, it's so important to do homework, understand kind of the treaty space we're operating in, the history we're operating in, the self-determination objectives. It's really common. I see in Canada a lot. I get colleagues who get really excited about, they got an announcement to proceed on this project, and it's so exciting. It's something they've been working for so long. But Indigenous peoples might not have that same level of excitement because they've been working on their own self-determination objectives. And so a really important step is seeing where those things can align, because we really want to make sure, kind of from our perspective, a key part of renewing the relationship is making sure we're addressing what Indigenous peoples view as self-determination from their lens and not from ours. In the bottom left of the screen, it's just, I've included a number of words that the Supreme Court of Canada has really defined over hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of pages. So it is, what does meaningful mean? What does good faith mean? What does, like, all of these things have really exhaustive definitions, and we know kind of, and ways that we can demonstrate are meaningful or are not meaningful. It means things like not sending 4,000-page technical documents to Indigenous peoples and asking them to meet you next week to have a conversation about them. So it's giving kind of the time and the space and the capacity, and that sometimes means capacity funding, to partners to come to the table in a way that works for them. And I'd say, just on the ground, what we know from our teams that are on the ground across the north in particular are that engaging at the local level is so fundamental. So to really engage with folks in the north, I would have said, if I was here 15 years ago, I'd be saying get on the radio, because everybody listened to radio. Today I'd say get on the community Facebook page if you actually want to get anyone's attention across the north, or put a poster up at the local co-op, because those are the things that get read, and that's how you'll actually get the attention of community members. And we've heard about what it means to provide training opportunities and employment opportunities. That's where some of the real important connections lie. I would say we've heard also about a number of these other things about, there is systemic racism, there are really intimidating spaces for Indigenous peoples to come into, and many of them are not ready to come into the spaces. And so just kind of being mindful and thinking about new and different ways to create welcoming spaces. And that also does mean two different ways of knowing. So how can we value different knowledge systems as well, and sit them alongside some of the Western science that we're working with? There's, I think, always a really great pathway there. We just don't know what it looks like until we start on it. And then I think the last piece I would just say is one of the things we do in our organization quite a bit is really have a frank conversation about cultural competency. It is such a different type of skill set to be able to build a meaningful relationship. And so checking, like, we often think about, well, this partner doesn't have the capacity to come to the table, but I think we also, one of the things we challenge, and we have a mandatory training policy for every team member in our department, for example, who must undertake cultural competency training every single year, and that's fundamental for them to be able to go to tables. And so I think the other part is really acknowledging kind of the mandate that's being brought to the table might not always fit. What are you going to Indigenous peoples for? Is it to kind of check a box? Is it to renew a relationship? Is it, and so really understanding kind of the intent is, I think, a really important starting point. So with that, I think I'll leave it there, and just thank you very much for your attention and the invitation.
Okay, so we'd be very interested in having questions or comments from the other MSI facilities in terms of their approach to community engagement, and in particular, your approach around engagement of Indigenous communities. Yeah. I think you might have to walk or shout.
Okay. Hello? Great. Okay. Yeah, my name's Stephen Jones. I'm with the CGEN MSI. One of the questions around engagement and particularly in training, and one of the things that I've been involved with over the years is genomic and bioinformatic training done through the modality of workshops. And obviously we have had a hiatus over the COVID period, but we're now starting them up again. Traditionally, they'd always been done in person as workshops that you would attend. And because of lots of reasons, including cost, they would typically be in the major conurbations, you know, Toronto and Montreal and Vancouver. And now as we're starting up, we're looking at how we can make access to these workshops and this training more equitable, and realizing that for a lot of people it's quite difficult or expensive to travel to Vancouver or Toronto, particularly if you're quite far north. So of course one obvious solution is, well, why don't we do the workshops all over Zoom? And so just wanting people's feedback on, from a cultural and social perspective, is that a good solution? Is it just too easy? Let's not worry about the internet and any technical thing. Let's just take that as given. But I'm just thinking from a cultural and social perspective, if we start running our workshops over Zoom, remotely, is that a good solution, or should we be looking for other solutions?
I'm going to turn to the panelists first, but other people might want to respond from the audience as well. Sorry, is the mic on?
There, is this on now? Yeah. Okay, yeah. So, I mean, we were facing similar challenges, in particular, just thinking about this community fishers training course that I've described there. We did it all in person before the pandemic, and then for a year and a half, we really tried to deliver it. We repurposed it, we made it an online workshop, we tried to deliver the training in remotely, and it just did not work. Now we do a combination, so we either offer it full in person, or we offer the theory session virtually, and then some later time we do an in-person section. And I think what you really gain, what we found is what you're losing out if you're doing it all remotely, aside from the hands-on dealing with the tech that you need to learn, is really, it's the relationship building, it's the community, it's a shared learning that happens, and that broader reach. If you do it all remotely, typically you can communicate the particular scientific content or whatever it is that you want to teach, but you don't get the broader impact of having people actually learn together.
I would agree with that. I think do it virtually, and we've also done, I don't know if this is on, I'll try to talk really loud. Done a variety of things virtually. but it's much better in person or a blended approach. I mean, there's lots of, working with communities, I think there are a lot of barriers that we don't even understand or think about. And I mean, one of the things that I'm always thinking about and trying to kind of get to is what are those barriers that, you know, young people have in getting into science generally. And I think if you're setting things up from the beginning as a virtual kind of presentation style workshop, then yeah, you're not, it's just not as effectively dealing with those barriers at all.
Yeah. And I might just add from our experience, I would say there's a lot of benefits to the virtual because it means a lot of folks can stay home close to their support systems, which is really important for them. But we can't think that the technical challenges aren't, or the logistics challenges aren't going to be a huge barrier, particularly in the north. The broadband space for that type of opportunity is extremely limited, and we know if you're looking in Nunavut as an example, there's extreme overcrowding, and the housing shortage is so enormous that having one person on a screen in a home that's overcrowded, there's not a lot of space for privacy there, and so how can you dedicate your time and self to something like that? So there, I think as my colleague said, having a blended approach is probably best. The one point I'd make, I think, particularly in the north, is the colleges and universities across the north provide an access pathway that it really is unmatched. It is a way to kind of gain access to a generation that's poised and ready to kind of have a curious mind about this type of learning.
Hi, my name is Warren Walkerchuk. I'm from Glyconet Integrated Services, MSI. I had a question about how do you get cultural competency with Indigenous groups? So a number of years ago, I did a cultural competency workshop, and there was no mention of Indigenous culture at all, which I thought was kind of odd. But one of the things that we're doing is we're working, say, on vaccines or therapeutics that might be relevant to peoples in the north. And so we need a starting place, I think, to understand that. So can you give a primer of where you would look to try to get this cultural competency so that you can understand how to approach Indigenous groups in the first place?
It may be, can you direct us to the primer?
Sure. So it's a really great question, and just the area of cultural competency has kind of exploded in the last number of years, and cultural literacy. And so I would say as it has been growing, the number of providers, particularly Indigenous providers who can provide this type of learning, they have developed quite a bit, the type of programming and the accessibility of it over the last number of years. The policy that we have for every single employee in our department is as flexible as possible, because we know the providers are not always there, and they're not as standardized as we'd normally look to in some training programs. Having said that, the flexibility provides us the space for individuals to look within and say, well, actually, I spent this time here in my career, and I have a good comfort level with that. So maybe that's not my gap. Maybe my gap is here. And so where in this space, the example I give very often is I am First Nations. I connect very easily with First Nations culture. It is something that's a little bit more intuitive for me. I've spent a huge portion of my career working across the north, and so Inuit culture is also very recognizable to me. I can navigate it quite easily because of the experience I have. But I know very little about Métis culture, and Canada didn't recognize Métis rights until very recently. And so for me, that's a knowledge gap for me, but that might not be for you, because maybe, and for me, it's something I felt I needed in my job to do my job well. So I think it's a real individual assessment about what what factors and where folks feel like their learning has to be navigated towards. So I would say I encourage all my team members to really look to Indigenous providers and kind of be open to the learning experience.
Thank you.
Maybe
Perhaps,
oh, sorry. Can I just add one thing to that? So the other thing that we have been intentional about doing is bringing in elders to be part of, we have presentations that happen at the Experimental Lakes area on Wednesday evenings during the open water season, and we make sure to bring in at least one elder and a natural resource manager to talk about kind of their experiences and be able to give us advice. We have a fall feast where we bring elders and youth from communities, and part of that is a dialogue between scientists and elders. And so I think you can do the cultural literacy courses, and that's super important, but also giving opportunity for your kind of staff and scientists and students to be exposed and be talk to Indigenous community members and elders is really goes a long way.
Very true. I think it's also important, this will be the last comment, we'll start the networking. Okay. I think it's also important for the MSI facilities to think through in the context of your community or communities that you are embedded in or interacting with. What are the priorities for cultural literacy and cultural familiarity? Because you've heard specific examples here where the facility and the research is really embedded in the land and in the water. And the relationships are critical, actually. And the opportunity for building those relationships is very clear and proximate. Other facilities that may not have the same opportunity, we'll put it that way, but within your communities, what are the priorities? What is it that you can do in this positive relationship of building communities and communities building your relationships? And how do you engage members and peoples of those communities meaningfully, respectfully, appropriately to enrich the community and enrich your research? So I guess across our facilities, our needs are not necessary, and approaches are probably going to be tailored both by the individual needs of the people at our facilities and our research community and our research activities, but also by the nature of our research and our interactions. So I saw...
I'm going to have the privilege of asking the last question, if I may. I'm Sandra Zoran from the CFI. So first of all, thank you for a very interesting presentation. Really appreciate it. So Janet kind of answered some of my question that I'm going to pose, that there are very different communities and contexts. I was wondering, this is a question to everyone in the room or to those of you on stage, have you found that your collaborations with communities have changed the course or direction of the science done at your facilities?
I'm going to turn to the panel first because I have this feeling it's going to be yes, yes, yes. And ours as well.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, we have a big body of work that's starting this past year on wild rice that was a direct result of kind of relationships between Vince Pallas, our head scientist, and Métis business in Manitoba, and then Treaty 3 communities that we work with. We've also, the challenge that we've had is what I sort of talked about a little bit, is that, thinking about the kinds of experiments that we do, there's not necessarily Indigenous knowledge on plastics, but bringing in dialogue around those kinds of research and those kinds of needs has helped us define the projects in a way that makes sure that we're addressing the needs. And then the example of incorporating ceremony, I mean, I consider that now part of the science of that study. And so, yeah, it's definitely changed kind of how we work and the science itself. Yeah,
wholehearted yes here as well, of course. I mean, the priorities that communities have identified to us certainly shape the way we're thinking about how the way we collect ocean observing data, or what instruments we use, and more importantly, perhaps, how we deal with the data that is being collected. So having the ability to enter into data agreements and really respect the ownership and control of the data, being able to incorporate local and traditional knowledges into the way the data is archived in our data management system and how it's shared back with the community, applying biocultural labels to some of the data. So really it's influenced more so how we're interacting with the information that is collected by the community, and then is shared back as well.
And ours would be a similar experience as a group that designs and sponsors clinical trials testing innovative treatments for patients with cancer or at risk for cancer. We've embedded patient carers, the public, with an interest in all aspects of our research process. So it's formulating questions, reviewing proposals, evaluating the research intervention, the protocol that we're following in the conduct of the trial, the endpoints selected. And in addition, they advocate for our activities. We've run into trouble, as one example, where we couldn't, or we were losing access to a specific drug therapy. And it was our patient and public committee who advocated and ultimately sort of reversed the decision and established a new supply for us. So without a doubt, the community can be engaged and can contribute and improve the quality, the type of research, assist in the research success, and also the development of policy and adoption of the research outcomes. It is a positive cycle. It's a wonderful interaction. But it does require work. It does require resource, specific opportunities for engagement, specific approaches, means of communication. So it requires an investment of time and effort and funding to do it well. I appreciate that we've cut into our networking time, so I encourage everybody to continue discussions with one another across facilities, and I guess we are reconvening at 11:45. Thank you. Thank you, panelists.